Welcome everybody, good afternoon. Welcome to this SDG Academy session organized by the SDG Commission of Bubiano di Curaçao. And I hope you can all hear me and be online. Okay, this session is the second session of our SDG Action Week 2022. We organize the SDG Action Week each year. It's the third time this year that we do that, and we do that this year in combination with Semana de Cultura. The theme of the Semana de Cultura is Ban Knuku, Ban Planta. You can take that very literally. We take it a little bit more figurative. Just make sure that you as a person, as an organization, as a country can grow and learn from each other and from the SDGs. And the SDGs, of course, also have the little another. They also have the Ban Knuku Ban Planta in their SDGs themselves. Throughout the week, we have a few SDG Academy sessions, so please check our program for that. We also have 3 roundtable sessions starting tomorrow from 9 till 11. They are on people, planet, and prosperity. So make sure that you subscribe and enter that session as well. Today, I want to welcome our very special guest, Mark Thomas. I'm very happy that he can share his experience, that he's going to share his experience with us on this subject. His duties at the UN include support for strategic planning and the coordination of partnerships, both among UN agencies and between the United Nations and development actors from public, private, and civil society sectors. And he has to participate in resource and finance mobilization for acceleration of the Sustainable Development Goals. Prior to working with the UN, Dr. Thomas was the Chief Executive Officer of the Cropper Foundation, one of Trinidad and Tobago's most respected civil society organizations, working in the field of private sector approaches to sustainable development issues. He was also communications specialist at the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Agency, lecturer in psychology and development biology at the University of the West Indies, and a World Health Organization research fellow at the National Institute of Health. Very impressive, Dr. Thomas. I want to share my screen with you for the program. It's going to be very straightforward. We're going to have, of course, this short introduction. Then we have our keynote speaker for about 45 minutes, and then the public can ask questions. You can also put your questions in the Q&A section of the screen or in the chat. If everything's fine, maybe in the chat you can already find some links that we put there for some more in-depth information. If they're not there yet, I'm going to put them there in a minute. So, well, I think we have a very beautiful program, and I don't want to, I'm stop sharing. I don't want to get into the time of Mark Thomas. So please, Mark, if you can take the floor, it's yours.
Thanks, Annelies. I hope I'm pronouncing your name right.
Yeah, it's fine.
All right.
Thank you.
So I hope everyone can see my screen. I apologize. My camera on my laptop does not work. And in spite of the IT department's best efforts here, it still hasn't been resolved. So I've put a picture of myself there. Not that anyone wants to see my face, but that's what I look like. I hope everyone can see. All right.
Yes, thank you,
Okay.
Thomas.
All right.
Yeah.
So as Annalise said, my presentation today is about the SDG funding landscape and Aruba's position in it. I've never been to Aruba, I have to confess. So some of the things that
Mark,
I
I have to
know, I know.
Curacao, no?
No,
Yes.
Curacao.
Yeah.
Yes, yes. No, the reason why I made that slip is that I have been to Aruba. Okay, so that's why I made that slip. All right. So yes, I've never been to Curacao. I have been to Aruba. So some of the things I would be talking about might be a bit speculative. All right. And you may actually know some of the things better than I do. So I apologize for that in advance. All right. So that's my contact information, my email at the bottom. If anybody has any questions following this event, I'm happy to address them. And basically what I want in terms of the objectives of this session is to discuss, introduce, again, in 45 minutes, I don't think I can go through everything that has to do with SDG financing. That can take an entire textbook. But I just wanted to introduce some of the concepts with regards to SDG financing and probably discuss about how they relate to Curacao. And then also to suggest how the UN can probably going forward, support Curacao in its mobilization of SDG funding to accelerate its accomplishment of the SDGs. Right. So what is the issue at hand? All right, according to the UN, it requires, there's actually a shortfall right now in terms of the funding that's required for countries to meet the SDGs by 2030. And there's a shortfall, an annual shortfall every year, a shortfall of about US $2.5 trillion, right? So every country, by and large, is falling short of the amount of money that it needs in order to accomplish the Sustainable Development Goals, and I'm sure Curacao is one of them. And in fact, there is a shortfall, an annual shortfall of $1 trillion every year just to deal with clean energy alone. Right? Now, these things have been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic and the subsequent economic conditions that have been further exacerbated by the Russia-Ukraine war. Before COVID-19, I'm sorry for my spelling error there, it was countries on average needed to devote 11.7% of their GDP, right? An additional 11.7% of their GDP towards the accomplishment of the goals. And after the pandemic, this has now grown to 14.2%. So although the funding requirements were significant before, we were encountering a significant shortfall before, the shortfall is now much worse. And I'm sure Curacao, you're seeing this as well. I want to start with public financing because it's the sort of, it's the financing that as a country you can deal with most readily and most quickly. So it's the most reliable source of financing for the SDGs comes from domestic revenue and taxation, right? Unfortunately, many countries now collect taxes below the levels that are required, right? When we talk about tax effort, which is the ratio of actual tax revenues to what you can potentially collect as tax revenues, it's generally below 50%. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to find a value for Curacao, but again, it's so general across countries, even in the OECD countries, that I'd imagine that this would also apply to Curacao as well, that in terms of the actual tax revenue collected, there is a significant gap between that and what you can potentially collect. And therefore, one way in which countries can finance the SDGs is by gradually increasing the tax to GDP ratios, right? And you do this by revamping your tax policies and having administrative reforms. And these are readily achievable objectives that you don't have to rely on anyone else for. All right. That said, the UN can, of course, support Curacao as a country in terms of like its medium-term revenue strategy. We have diagnostic tools, and of course we have multiple experts that can assist Curacao in enhancing its domestic resource mobilization. And we can also help build capacity to enhance Curaçao's spending efficiencies, fiscal transparency. I think generally you all are quite good in terms of fiscal transparency and other aspects of public financial management. So the first thing to think about when you're thinking about the SDGs and financing the SDGs is in terms of your domestic revenue, your taxes, and is that process, is that mechanism as effective as it can be? In general, it isn't. Again, I can't speak directly for Curacao taxes, but I would guess there is room for improvement, as it is in most countries. Just a second. All right. But even then, you'd find that even if you were able to mobilize your public finances, there would probably still be a gap between what you can raise domestically and what you would need in order to fully accomplish the Sustainable Development Goals by the year 2030. And this would require financing that comes from not just from the public purse, but from other sources. All right. And of course, the one that I suppose people generally think about when they think is sort of what people call concessional financing. You'll also see this also referred to as ODA, or Official Development Assistance. And these are grants that when you get it, you don't have to repay it. Right, those were really beautiful in the old days. They're much fewer now and farther between. Loans, when you get the loans from the lender, you as the borrower get more favorable rates than the traditional market rate, right, that you would get in the marketplace. You have loans on more favorable terms, more favorable repayment terms, longer periods to repay with lower interest rates, etc. Although, as I think has been the experience with Curacao, you find that those sort of concessional loans come with a bunch of conditions, right, that the borrower can insist that you impose. And I know that that can be sort of like a fraud politically. Also, you have something called, which are like first loss guarantees. So it's like where a third party would compensate the lender if the borrower defaults. All right. So you would find that if you're unable to sort of like debt refinancing, right? So you owe a particular amount of money that you're struggling to repay to the borrower. A third party lender will say, we will cover that for you, provided that you then take certain other actions. And a good example of that would be sort of like debt restructuring to like deal with climate change, etc. All right. And of course, the source of these things, the persons who are usually like the source of concessional finances are usually like major financial institutions like the development banks, the World Bank, for example, multilateral funds like the International Monetary Fund. So those a lot of the concessional funds come from these agencies. All right. Grants. Unfortunately, in general, grants tend to be relatively small amounts. All right. So when you get a grant, generally you can only finance something that's catalytic that would then lead to something bigger down the line. Grants are usually too small to like do something really large. The only sort of like large grants that you can probably find, I would imagine, would be something from like the Green Climate Fund, right? The GCF, which is a potential for relatively large grants. The process though of accomplishing or achieving a Green Climate Fund grant is quite onerous. And I know lots of countries have been complaining that the process is too intense for them to accomplish. Now, this is important in terms of Curacao, and it applies to Trinidad and Tobago, where I sit as well, is that grants And a lot of concessional financing in general tend to be targeted at low income or least developed countries. All right. And you find that the more developed you are, the higher you are classified in terms of human development, the less accessible these concessional finances are to you. All right. Now, Curacao, you have a very particular problem in that, like as a member state in major international institutions, your member state is the Netherlands, which is, of course, one of the richest countries in the world. All right. So sometimes you apply for some of these grants and people will see that your member state is the Netherlands, and you will face that obstacle. There is a sort of move now to move away from just the country's income to the country's vulnerability. So for example, like vulnerability to hurricanes, you all are a small island, so you're vulnerable to influxes of population, like with the Venezuelan migrant crisis. So there is a change from like the low income status, and, or I shouldn't say there is a change, there is a push for that change to go from just income or development status to using something which is called the multivariate multivariate vulnerability index. All right. So it's like you use multiple variables about your vulnerability, and then you're ranked on a particular index about how vulnerable you are as a state, right, in order to access concessional financing. We are not there yet. All right. So I think in terms of concessional financing, probably a good bet for Curacao would be like the EU, right? Where, you know, EU does contribute concessional financing to member states and to overseas territories of member states. And of course, there, like I said, the Green Climate Fund, the World Bank and stuff like that, but the sizes of the grants that you, and concessional financing that you would get there may not be as significant as you would wish it to be, because currently the mode of operation is about the income of the country. Which brings us to non-concessional financing. And I know that you all have been here as well in the recent past, which is really about loans. All right. And it's loans. Generally, these come from like development banks and multilateral funds. I think in your recent history, you had a loan from the Dutch government, all right, in the post-COVID-19 pandemic sort of era. Generally, even here then, because it's a development loan, you may find that the terms, the interest rate and terms, right, may be more, usually less generous than in terms of the concessional loans, right? So if you're getting a concessional loan, you get it on more favorable terms than a concession, than non-concessional financing, which generally tends to be at the market rates. Now, it brings us to private financing. If you're in a sort of like high income bracket as you are now, probably a good place to turn would be to private finance. All right. And there are several areas or several avenues for private finance that are possible going forward. All right. One thing that I have here is philanthropy, which is basically donating to good causes. All right. Now, I know that UNDP did a study of philanthropy in the Caribbean, and they found that on average, Caribbean companies give between 2 and 4% of their profits towards philanthropy. So we have very generous companies in the Caribbean, all right? And I know that there's a long and strong history of philanthropy with Dutch businesses. The Dutch heritage and philanthropy are sort of like very strongly intertwined. So there is a lot of money out there from companies that can be directed towards the sustainable development goals, right? The problem right now is that there is very little alignment with philanthropy, right, and the sustainable development goals. That alignment between what companies give to and the sustainable development goals can be strengthened, all right? And This can be done via enabling policies, like having a policy on philanthropy that, you know, that rewards or provides incentives for companies that align their philanthropy with the Sustainable Development Goals. Like if they're achieving, let's say, SDG target 5.2, right, with their philanthropy, there is, for example, you know, your philanthropy, you get better tax breaks or licenses to operate than other companies. All right, but just bear in mind that, of course, with philanthropy, and I'll touch on this in my next session on Thursday as well. It is negative to the company's bottom line. It's companies giving money away. All right. Oops, sorry. Yeah. Now we have a field in the chat. I put a link to this book. We did a philanthropy field book, but specifically for Trinidad and Tobago, but I think it can be applied in any of the Caribbean countries, where it can assist companies with aligning their philanthropy with the Sustainable Development Goals. All right, and making therefore their philanthropy more impactful, right, in terms of the country's development. Now, the next thing with private finance is, of course, corporate social responsibility. You'd see this abbreviated as CSR. All right. And this is where companies recognize that they have impacts on the society and economic and social environmental impacts. Right. And they then engage in business practices and business operations that enhance their performance in these areas. All right. So you have companies, for example, may change their light bulbs from incandescent light bulbs to LEDs, right? You know, sort of like more energy efficient light bulbs. That technically has very little to do with the company's business per se, right? It's not part of like their products and their services, but in the process of how they go about functioning, they do so in a more sustainable manner. All right. They offer us, you know, like internships for young people to come and intern and learn the trade, etc. This is all corporate social responsibility. All right. This too is also cash flow negative. All right. You know, if you're going to make a change if you're going to change all the bulbs in your company from incandescent bulbs to LED bulbs, that's a cost to your company, right? At least in the short term. But of course, you are then achieving something that's more you're moving your company more in the direction of sustainability. Now, you may know that it's for CSR, there is a resource to assist companies with their CSR, and this comes from the ISO. And ISO 26000 deals with social responsibility of companies. So by adopting ISO 26,000, by companies adopting ISO 26,000 and becoming ISO 26,000 compliant, right? They can enhance their CSR and make their CSR more aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals, right? And this is available online. You can just look up ISO 26,000. Right. Brings us to ESG. All right. Now, ESG, and I'm sure many of you would have heard this acronym, and it means environment, social, and governance. All right. And what it does, it views those particular those particular impacts of the company, whether it's social impact, environmental impact, and governance, both from the external things acting on the company and the company acting on, let's say, the environment or the society in which it acts, right? They view those things as sort of like sort of synergistic and like symbiotic, all right? That a company exists within an environment and is dependent on the environment, for example, and impacts the environment, all right? And a company that does not recognize that it is also reliant on the environment and that it has an impact on the environment can't capitalize on all the opportunities that exist for that company and puts itself at risk, right? So I'll give you a good example. So let's say like a company is very reliant on water resources, all right? A company uses a significant amount of water. It is in that company's interest to ensure that water management proceeds well within that country or within the society in which it's operating. All right, because if water is poorly managed in that society, and if the company itself poorly manages its water use, the company is put at risk, and investors and so on looking on at that company will then view that company as a less favorable investment. I hope that sort of makes sense. All right. So by adopting these sort of ESG practices, right, you can have a company in a better position to mitigate risks, right, from be it environmental risks, social risks, governance risks like laws, etc., and new regulations, and become more attractive to investors. The thing is, by a company becoming more environmentally friendly, more socially responsible, and better governed and more in tune with the governance structures within the country in which it operates and the wider governance structures around the world, that company will become more attractive to investors, right? And you find that this has been a real trust right now, that 10% of all investment in the world as at the end of 2021 are now ESG investments, right? The largest investment firm in the world, which is BlackRock, is almost entirely devoted to ESG investments. ESG investments is at 41 trillion US dollars right now, and it's anticipated to be at 53 trillion dollars by the end of 2025. So in a country like Curacao, right, where you have, let's say your tourism businesses, if you can enhance the adoption of ESG principles by your businesses there, for example, you will become more attractive to investors that are looking for attractive investment in tourism. All right. And therefore, what you're doing is that companies are addressing the SDGs, not just via their philanthropy or via sort of like sidebar things like, changing light bulbs, but actually by their core business. All right. And I'm just showing here that ESG investing is about $40 trillion right now, right? And this is from Credit Suisse. And we have developed an ESG toolkit, right? Right now, the link that I've put in the chat is for a little pocket guide to ESG, where if you have like companies and business chambers and so on, can get the basics about ESG, right? And then we're also developing a full guide and toolkit that would be available by the end of October, all right? So that companies can do these things, and by their reporting, because companies generally have to report, especially listed companies on stock exchanges, they all have to do these annual reports. Via annual reporting on their sustainability, they can demonstrate to investors how they are satisfying certain environmental criteria, social criteria, and governance criteria, all of which overlap significantly with the Sustainable Development Goals. All right. Okay. Now I put this little graphic up here. All right. We sort of talked about the private sector. I'm going to come to the green investment and the social investment when we talk about impact bonds. I just wanted to talk about blended finance bit. All right. So blended finance is sort of like a hybrid financing between public and private. Okay. So what you see in the bottom right, on the bottom right of this slide, you see that what you do, you can have investment, generally public investment, right, being used strategically to mobilize additional, private finance. So the state, for example, will commit some funds to a particular action, right, that's related to accomplishment of the SDGs in the interest of attracting private investment to complement that state. So what you do then have is a public-private partnership, or what you see as a PPP. All right. So PPPs are example of blended finance, where you have public finance being used as a catalyst to then bring private finance to the table. And then you have public and private finance working hand in hand towards the accomplishment of the Sustainable Development Goals. Okay. So it brings us to impact bonds. All right. Now, impact just means that what you're going to do is you're going to invest money in the hope that what you do has a particular impact going down the line. All right. In terms of the SDGs, of course, what you're thinking is that your impact would be the accomplishment of the Sustainable Development Goals, the meeting of the Sustainable Development Goal targets, etc. So we just covered like ESG investing in companies, and that's one example of impact investing. All right. More typically, when you hear about impact investing, it refers to these innovative financing instruments. And the ones that you would see most often referred to are the impact bonds. All right. Now, we always hear about green bonds and blue bonds, etc. Right. But there are a whole set of them, right? And they're generally in three categories. Right. They are environmental impact bonds, that that are targeted at meeting certain environmental targets, right, or environmental objectives. And those are your blue bonds and your green bonds, right? It's also worthwhile knowing that in addition to environmental impact bonds and blue bonds, green bonds, there are also social impact bonds. And in fact, you see like gender bonds, for example, right? Where you invest, companies, for example, or governments sell bonds to enhance sort of like gender equality within either the company or the government. And then when certain objectives are met, which we'll come to in a little bit about how these bonds work, then the investors get repaid, right, with interest, with their dividends. And then, of course, there are sustainability impact bonds, which are a combination of the two. So it's like they have elements of both environmental and social objectives being met, all right, with the sustainability impact bonds. Now, these impact bonds, right, they're an innovative financial mechanism, right, as I mentioned before. And what you do, you have governments or commissioners, people who commission these bonds, right? They enter into agreement with service providers, right, which generally tend to be like they're either for-profit or non-profit. They can be a company or it can be like an NGO, right? And then investors pay, right, so that these service providers can then undertake works towards particular outcomes, right? And those outcomes are predefined, all right? If the outcomes are achieved, then the investor is repaid, all right? Okay. Now, as I have here at the sort of like the bottom of the slide, the word bond is, although they're generally referred to as impact bonds, green bonds, blue bonds, etc. The word bond is sort of like a misnomer here. It's sort of misnamed. It's not properly named, right? In fact, when you hear these things, it's not in your typical way that when you think about bonds, they're really like outcomes-based contracts. What it is one person saying that if a particular outcome is achieved, then, you know, the money flows, all right? They're different in terms from other contracts, which are more focused on the inputs and the activities, all right? So although they are referred to as bonds, it's not in the typical way that you think of a bond where you buy a bond and then after 5 years it matures and then you go collect your money, all right? It's very tied to outcomes, right? If after the 5 years have passed, the outcomes are not achieved, then the payment does not happen, all right? Now, who are the players involved in these impact bonds, right? And in fact, I would say that possibly like in the way that we've talked about ESG, because like, you know, you all have your own stock market, you will have companies listed on the stock market in Curacao, right? ESG, if you got your stock market, for example, to include aspects of ESG disclosure, right, amongst the things that they require companies to disclose, which would make it more attractive to foreign direct investment, because a lot of foreign direct investment is moving towards ESG. Then you'd find that, you know, that's one aspect in which Curacao can possibly enhance its environment for attracting investment. But it's worth knowing like who the players are now when we talk about the bonds, right? Now, generally, you have the outcome payers, which are the governments and municipalities, for example, generally, right? So the government will pay whoever invests their money back with interest, right? They're the ones who are commissioning the bonds, right? And what you have is they identify the issues, they specify what the payable outcomes are. There can be intermediaries like consultants and stuff like that that assist with this process, which we'll come to in a little bit. And then you have the service providers. They can be non-profit, they can be NGOs, right? Or they can be for-profit. And then with the money that is provided by the investors, they then undertake work towards achieving the particular stipulated outcomes. All right, and they receive payments based on how they go on if they achieve their outcomes. All right, so there's money that's being held. These service providers, they come on board and they set about undertaking actions towards the sustainable development goals. As they achieve the sustainable development goals, they are paid. All right, and then because the government is achieving these developmental outcomes using the invested money, then the government can then repay the investors. If the developmental outcomes are not being achieved, the government does not repay the investors. I hope that makes sort of sense. Right, so and then you have the investors. They can be private investors. They're also like multilateral development banks that buy these impact bonds, and they provide the upfront funding, right, for the service provider to then go and finance the SDG related projects. And again, the investors will be repaid once the specific outcomes, the identified outcomes, are achieved. Now, because this is an investment thing and the money sizes of funds can be quite significant, you also need to have evaluators, and these are independent evaluators, sort of like the accounting houses, right? Like, you know, the Price Waterhouse, Deloitte, etc. KPMG, they will then come and certify that the outcomes were achieved. And then once the outcomes or objectives of the investment are achieved, then the commissioner of the bond, the government, will then repay the investors. And as I said, there are sort of intermediaries, which can be like consultants, local foundations, etc. Right? And I have a little diagram to show in a little bit. And this is sort of like how the impact bonds work here. I've put it for social impact bonds, right? So you have investors, right? And you have the money goes through these intermediaries, all right? It could be, for example, like the people who coordinate local services, all right? And then they pass it on to the service providers, the people who actually doing the work at ground level. They address the need, they deliver, right? The independent evaluators come and look at what was delivered to see, did it meet the stipulated objectives of the bond? And then once they then say yes, then the outcome payers then pay the money via the intermediary back to the investor. All right. So this is a little structure in which these sort of impact bonds are undertaken, and you can see the government there as as the outcome payer. All right, so you're attracting private investment, and the reason why I said it's like different from a regular bond is that if the outcomes or the deliverables are not met, there is no requirement for the government to then repay, all right, the money that was invested. Okay, so there is an extra layer of accountability there in terms of getting things done, right, when you have the bonds. Now, climate bonds, which you may have heard of, are like regular bonds, all right? So let's say like the government of Curacao was to issue a climate bond. They would say that, you know, within 10 years, when it matures, right, we will pay the investor back with a particular amount of interest, right? They are just like regular good old bonds. And the investors then just want the money back with their dividends at the end of that period. And the impetus then becomes on the government, right, or whoever issues the bonds, to then undertake the work towards that particular purpose. The layer of accountability there, of course, will probably be sort of political, that, you know, the electorate will hold the government to task the investor at this point probably does not, or may not care as much as they should about whether the climate particular outcomes are being accomplished here. All right, and that is it really. I think I've sort of gone through most of the things there. I don't know, I hope I kept the time. Yes.
Yes, you perfectly did, Mark.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you for this very informative and I think it's still going in depth, but because it's not my specialty, of course, my special interest, but it's an interesting field, absolutely. And I really hope maybe some of our participants are having questions. I just checked my Q&A. Somebody's asking for the slides, but I think we can provide that
yes,
for sure.
Yeah,
yes. It's not a problem.
And the supplemental materials that I put in the chat as well.
Yes, that would be fine. Then we can send them to them as well. Well, I myself had some questions because it always feels when you talk about bonds that it's about big countries, and maybe you have an example of a bond, maybe a green bond or just the social impact bonds that are also.
Yes, I think just recently Barbados, right? With and their particular investor, or it may have been the intermediary actually, was the Nature Conservancy. So the Nature Conservancy has just, I think it was $50 million US, right? For blue, so it's a blue bond, right? With regards to like marine sustainability, right? So there is one example where investors funneled money through the Nature Conservancy, right, which is the intermediary, and they then will go to service providers on the ground in Barbados, right, to undertake these works, right? If the objectives are met, right, then of course, and are successfully evaluated as such, right, by independent evaluators, then the government of Barbados will repay. All right. Okay. So it's a matter of raising funds that you don't have right now. Okay. Get the work done, and if the work is accomplished, and of course, because there is an impetus from that intermediary and the service providers to make sure that the objectives are accomplished, because without the objectives being accomplished, there is no continuous money being sent down the pipeline, right? Then when the things are accomplished, then the government has accomplished a developmental objectives. So there are examples of small countries establishing these bonds. All right.
Yeah. Yes, it's a great example. Maybe, yeah. Thank you so much for giving that one. I also have another question now from Andy Kirchner. He's an ecosystem facilitator for Collectivo. It's an organization here on Curaçao, and we give micro grants to local Curaçaoan projects. Do you have any examples of regional projects that receive funds from international organizations to funnel that to other smaller projects?
Yes. So again, I mentioned earlier, I can probably stop sharing. Right, so people, right. So I mentioned earlier, like the Green Climate Fund, right? So there's the GCF. There's also the Global Environment Facility, which is GEF, right? Which is also within the UN, right? So there, I of course I know the best the ones that are within the UN, all right? So there are organizations within the UN and probably within other multilateral agencies as well that can provide small grants towards initiatives within Curaçao. Okay, the GCF is very onerous, right? If you've ever seen a GCF application, it's quite large. And generally, I think they say on average, it costs like between 400,000 US dollars and 2 million US dollars just to prepare the application. All right. So for a small organization, that may be too onerous. But there are organizations that give smaller grants where the requirements are less intense. Was that answering the question? Yeah.
I hope so, but I can also ask Andrew to. Oh, yes, he says yes.
Yes.
I can also give you the floor, Andrew, if you would
Yes.
like to go on that one. I give you a little bit floor. Maybe. Yeah. Oh.
Yes.
Afternoon.
Yeah. But I would say that don't just think of the UN only. All right. There are, like, I mentioned the EU, right? And the EU, okay, you know, like of course, with like the EDF, for example, there are cycles of EDF announcements with grants. All right. I know that possibly via the Netherlands is a member state of the Inter-American Development Bank, right? I don't know what the specific relationship there, if like, you know, like Curacao has ever benefited from IDB initiatives in the past, all right? But I know that you are a member via the Netherlands, right? And the IDB, and I know the World Bank as well, were one of these agencies that were pioneering the MVI, the Multivariable Vulnerability Index, where they would consider vulnerability rather than income as a criteria for allocating concessional finance, right? So there are, I would suggest probably a good place to look at certain UN agencies, look at the EU, look possibly at the IDB, all right, and of course there are many other agencies that will give to particular not agencies, I should say, many other institutions, like for example, like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, all right? Just the name, pull one off the top of my head. They give money for health research and like vaccination drives, etc. If you have a particular cause, then you have to do your homework and go around and look for who's giving money, all right? But just bear in mind that the sort of climate, not climate in the way we were talking about earlier, but the climate in terms of the land, or I should say the landscape for SDG financing, that is moving more towards, it has moved away from giving money to well-off countries. And it's a problem that sort of like Trinidad is faced, and I'm sure it's a problem that you will face going forward. It does not mean that you will not get money, it just means that it'll be harder. Yes. Yeah,
I understand. Yeah, I was wondering if the index you are talking about, the country vulnerability index, is that the same index that they're going to use for the SIDS?
Right. So it is has arisen from the SIDS, because many SIDS are generally classified, and in fact most of this, almost all of the SIDS in the Caribbean, apart from like Haiti, right, are classified in the medium income to high income, right? And it's a problem for us because we don't then qualify for concessional finance, for a lot of the concessional finance. So this sort of like move to the multivariable vulnerability index has come from the SIDS, and from the landlocked developing countries. All right. So yes, so that said, that work is moving way too slowly for us. All right, because we're already in 2022, we're going to be in 2023 within a few months, and that leaves us with 7 years to accomplish the SDGs. Right. So in terms of waiting for the transition from ODA to go from income to vulnerability, that may take way too long. for us to actually achieve these particular objectives that we want in terms of sustainable development goals. The plus side of having, I'm sorry, I'm monopolizing the conversation. The plus side of having, being a high income country is that you generally have a very well developed private sector, all right? And I think the private sector, not that we should think of them as a sort of like, you know, ATM that we go to get money, all right? But we can think of ways in which we can engage them more. All right. So like, for example, the person who just asked about like a grant, is there a company in Curacao whose sort of like objectives are aligned with your objectives that you can then say, you know, can you give your philanthropy, you know, towards this particular recycling objective, right? So you may have like a beverage manufacturer there, for example, that may be wanting to enhance their brand and to show that they recycle. They may be more likely to give a grant to recycling if you pose it in that way. The government's position there is to try to encourage companies to align their philanthropy with the SDGs. Right now, it's a little bit more ad hoc. Right, you know, people give to this. It's more reactive than proactive, I should say. Something comes up and they say, okay, we will give. Another thing comes up, we will give. There is no sort of like strategy involved. And if you can make it a little bit more strategic, a little more aligned with the sustainable development goals and the targets and indicators of the sustainable development goals, then we may have more impactful philanthropy.
And what kind of policies government can use to encourage the private sector to do so?
Right. So let's say, so I think the government, a policy that creates a sort of enabling environment. I think, first of all, just to articulate that this is what the government's position on philanthropy has its benefits. All right, that, you know, in the government's opinion, philanthropy should, you know, these are the priorities in terms of development, and we would like to see philanthropy address these priorities. That's one. In terms of like, you know, like a lot of people give philanthropy in order to like, to then claim it on their taxes and so on like that. You can give more incentives in terms of like, you know, if you were giving your philanthropy to a particular SDG related objective, that a greater percentage of that would be written off of your taxes, right? So things like that. But generally, in terms of like a policy, I mean, Trinidad, we have a policy, it has not been enforced, but I think what is good is just for the government to say this is our position, right? In consultation with the private sector, not something that is imposed on them, but in consultation with the private sector, that you have like a consultation with them, and then together you all formulate what are the objectives, you know, in terms of philanthropy, what the country should be setting forth to accomplish with its philanthropy. Yeah.
Okay, yes, thank you so much. I was wondering if maybe somebody else has a question or a heads up. I can also give you the floor if you would like to have a direct question to Mark. And if not, I think we had a very in-depth session. No, nobody. We had a very good session. Thank you, thank you very much, Mark, for sharing your knowledge with us and helping us a little step further on our SDG road. I think you raised some very interesting suggestions and ideas, and I think we have some some good reading to do and some investigation on how the bonds work. For me, it's still very, very difficult to understand, but I'm sure there are people that understand this better. So I think we're going to I'm going to close this one. I want to invite you all for our next sessions tomorrow. Tomorrow from 9 till 11, we have our roundtable session on water, the source of life. And at 3:30 in the afternoon, we have a session on localizing the SDGs. And I think that that is really a part of the priorities that government sets. So in line with my question on what initiatives can government take to make sure that the private sector is interested in philanthropy. I think that would be a very nice thing, just to know that the government is setting priorities and in which areas we are doing that. So yes, I hope you can all subscribe to the next sessions. And I really, really want to thank Mark for his time to invest in us. Thank you, Mark. And I hope
I just put Trinidad's philanthropy and CSR policy. Not that it's perfect, but it sort of gives you an idea. All right.
Oh, very nice. Yes, thank you. I'm gonna get that one out from the chat box. Thanks. Yeah, thank you so much. And I hope to see you in the next session. And most certainly, oh, I'm sorry. Next Thursday, Mark will be our guest again in the session, and that's about making the SDGs the business case of the SDGs. Thank you.